Hi, boys and girls. It's that time again for Freedom Crossing. We're going to be finished this book this week. One of the days this week, you're going to have two videos to watch so that we can get all the chapters done before spring break and the end of the week. All right, so here we go. So we're ready for The Fastest Horse in Town, chapter 13. Of course, before we do that, we'll review our questions from chapter 12. The first question that I ask you in this book, Bert says that Pa says that a man's conscience is stronger than the law and that laws can be bad. And I ask you, what does he mean by that? And that was a tough question. So, what he means by that is that a man's conscience, his ability to know right from wrong and to do good, is stronger than the law. Some laws are bad. For example, a great example we can think of is Rosa Parks. Okay, she sat in the front of the bus. She started that protest because her conscience told her that that law was wrong. And so she stood up for what she thought was right. That's what they mean by that. A person's conscience can be stronger than the law. The second question that was on there was explain what the fugitive law states. And we talked about that in class before. The fugitive law stated that a slave catcher could capture any black man or woman and send them down south and claim that they were escaped slave and that that person had no rights. It also stated that they could now enter any northern states to search for and to capture slaves and bring them back, and that everybody in the north was responsible to do the same as well. Um, why don't slave sympathizers like Bert and Mr. Tryon want to draw attention to themselves? And because Bert says that they can do more good in secret. If they draw attention to themselves, then people will be watching them. Slave catchers, law enforcement would be watching them, and they wouldn't be able to help slaves escape. So his words are, we can do more good in secret. And finally, why is this chapter titled A Fugitive is Captured? Although the first half of the chapter is them at Tryon's Folly, the second part, we know that somebody says that a fugitive has been captured. They're worried that it could be Martin. At this time, we still don't know who it is, though. We just know there's a large crowd in town, and it seems that, unlike the South, the people there, they want the slave to be free. They want to get the slave catchers, not the slave. And so that's different to Laura as well. But we don't know who it is yet. Is it Martin? Is it George, that other slave that was hiding at Joel's house before? Let's find out. Here we go. We're on page 107. And the title of the chapter again is The Fastest Horse in Town. So you should have your book and read along with me. Freedom Crossing by Margaret Gough Clark. I do not own the rights, but I'm reading it to my students. Here we go. At Cayuga Street, Laura turned left and passed directly in front of the Todd house. Men were still posted there, near the front and rear entrances. Joel had the window to the right of the porch wide open and was leaning out so far that he was in danger of falling into the bed of zinnias below. His hair was tousled by the wind and his eyes were snapping with excitement. Although Laura was only a few feet from him, he seemed to pay no attention to her. His eyes were on the crowd up the street. Thus ignored, Laura hurried by with burning cheeks. She wished she knew why he had failed to greet her. Was it because he did not want the guard at the front door to know they were acquainted? Or couldn't he forgive her for her southern sympathies? Perhaps, she thought sadly, they would never again be friends. Across the street, on the southeast corner of Cayuga and Fifth Streets, top of page 108, stood the Presbyterian Church. It was built of stone and was quite imposing with its bell tower and its front portico with four graceful columns. The two large front doors at either end of the porch were closed, and several men stood before them, holding off the crowd that filled the lawn and overflowed onto the road in front of the building. Set him free, shouted a man. At once the call was repeated by many voices. Set him free! Again, Laura was torn by conflicting emotions. All these people were concerned over one black man. They had stopped whatever they were doing to come to look at him and to try to keep him from being sent back down south. Yesterday she couldn't have understood this, but now she knew Martin, and that made all the difference in the world. Before, she had thought of slaves as property, belonging to plantation owners such as Uncle Jim. But now, because of Martin, she knew that slaves were people. and it was only right that a person should have the chance to live a life of his own. No one should own a person. At the right of the church, two boys were taking turns boosting each other up so they could see into a small window that was an inch or two ajar. As she watched, she saw an angry sheriff's deputy chase them away. Laughing, the boys ran down the slope. Laura scurried after them and, panting, she asked, "Did you see him?" "Who?" asked the elder of the two boys. "The runaway." "I just saw him a minute." "What does he look like?" "Black," said the boy. He exchanged a glance with his friend and laughed. "He looks like any black man. They all look alike." Laura felt indignant. The very idea, saying all blacks look alike. You might as well say all white people looked alike. They were thin or fat or old. They were young like Martin and had big eyes that looked scared or merry or grateful. Something was happening on the porch of the church. Shouts and the sound of a scuffling reached her ears. But from where she stood, she couldn't see what was going on. The few people who were not already crowded around the front porch of the church hurried to get there. Laura was about to go up to the hill again when she noticed a man wearing a deputy's badge slip quietly into a small side door near the rear of the church. Less than a minute later, he came out leading a tall, slim, black dressed in a shabby blue shirt and tan pants. Behind him was another deputy. At the same moment, a carriage came hurtling down Fifth Street from the direction of the town. One glance told Laura that it was the Eastman carriage drawn by Sally, top of page 110, galloping for all she was worth. Down the hill, she came directly toward Laura, who stood speechless and motionless. Someone pushed her roughly back against the wall of the church. Afterward, she couldn't say whether it was one of the deputies or the black who had shoved her to safety. But confused though she was, she looked hard at the two men in the carriage. One she had never seen before, but the other was the black-bearded man who had been in Josiah Tryon's tailor shop. The black-bearded man who had the reins shouted to Sally and pulled her to a halt. He reached out of the carriage, seized the black by the wrist, and hoisted him into the carriage beside him. With a crack of a whip, the carriage was off again, continuing down the hill, even faster than before. So the deputies were just bringing the captured fugitive and slave out of the church when along comes Bert and Laura's carriage with Sally flying down the road, and one of the men, the black-bearded man from Josiah Tryon's tailor shop, reaches out, grabs the fugitive slave, and puts him into the carriage, and off they go. I wonder who it was. Let's get back to the book. Someone in the crowd in front of the church shouted, "There he goes!" Two men, both of whom Laura recognized as being among the slave hunters who had come to the house looking for Martin, leaped into a carriage and took chase. Laura doubted that they could catch up, for the first carriage had a long head start, and Sally, as Bert had said, was the fastest horse in town. One of these deputies, who had been with the black, disappeared into the church, but a crowd quickly gathered around the other deputy. Laura, with her back against the rough stone wall of the church, page 111, found that she couldn't leave unless she were to push her way through the horde of men. Timidly, she remained where she was, getting more and more uncomfortable and uneasy. "What happened? Why'd you let him go?" a man asked the deputy. The deputy seemed as puzzled as Laura. "We were going to move him over to the sheriff's house for safekeeping. You never can tell what might happen with a crowd like this, and we didn't want anybody getting hurt. Next thing we knew, that carriage came down the hill, and a fellow grabbed the fugitive and took off with him. You should have had him handcuffed to you. Sounds to me like you didn't put up much of a fight." To Laura's dismay, the slave hunter named Walt joined the group. "We're going to get to the bottom of this," he declared. "I think you had this all set up." "We were going to take him to the courthouse in Lockport as soon as we could," protested the deputy. "We want justice done, same as you." "I don't like your idea of justice," Walt snarled. As the deputy started to walk away, Walt reached out to seize him, but several of the local citizens came quietly between the two men, giving the deputy time to escape. Do you think that the deputy knew that somebody was going to come and help the fugitive escape and was a part of the plan to help the fugitive escape? What do you think? Laura, seeing an opening, edged away from the wall of the church and started up the hill. She had, top of page 112, taken only a few steps when Walt blocked her way. "Miss Eastman, what do you know about this?" he demanded. "You were down here when it happened. I saw you." "Nothing," she stammered. "That was your horse and carriage. I'd know it anywhere." "Who was that in the carriage?" he insisted. "I don't know." She tried to get around him, but as quickly as a cat, he leaped in front of her again. As quickly as a cat. What type of figurative language is that? As quickly as a cat. Walt glared at her. "You're no Southerner. You're just like everyone else in this town, ready to break the law." "Let me go," Laura cried out. "I'm not through with you yet." Laura was close to despair. The crowd was scattering and no one seemed to pay attention to her. Then she saw Bert coming toward them. He had never looked as good to her as he did at that moment. She ducked wildly around Walt and ran to her brother. Bert growled, "You leave my sister alone." And to Laura's surprise, Walt backed away. It couldn't be that he was afraid of a tall, thin 13-year-old. It must be that he had seen the sheriff coming down the church steps and realized he would get no sympathy from that source. Bert took Laura's elbow and said quietly, "Let's go." Top of page 113. "That was our carriage," she whispered, still trembling. "I know it," Bert sounded impatient, "and so does everyone else. Everyone in town knows Sally. Wait till Pa hears about this. We'll really be in trouble." He looked accusingly at Laura. "Why didn't you stay in the carriage?" "I wanted to see if it was Martin. I had just as much a right to look as you did." Bert dropped the subject. "I wish I knew who was in that carriage." "One of the men was that fellow we saw from Mr. Tryon's shop today. The man with the black beard." "Is that so?" "Well," Bert looked hopeful, "I wonder—" "What do you wonder?" Bert glanced around to see if anyone was near them. "That man might be connected with the Underground Railroad." "Of course, it was someone from the Underground Railroad," said positively. "Who else would steal a fugitive away?" "Some of the slave catchers might. It's the fellow who takes a slave down south who gets the bounty. The bounty is the money." A carriage drawn by a sturdy black horse came up beside them. The sheriff leaned out. "Do you and your sister need a ride home, Bert?" "Thanks, we sure do." Top of page 114. As they traveled out the ridge road toward home, Laura couldn't help smiling to herself as she tried to guess what Mrs. Fitch would think if she saw them being taken home by the sheriff. When he stopped in front of the Eastman house, the sheriff said, "Don't worry about your horse and carriage. I'm sure we'll get them back for you." Laura wondered how he could be so positive. Which brings me back to that question, do you think the deputies and the sheriff helped that fugitive escape and made that plan? All right, well, there'll be a couple more questions with that Google form. See you soon.